Hi, everyone. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live. Mayank, Nisha, and I are very happy to see you here today. Today's topic is something that I'm personally very excited about. It's all about content supply chain and how AI, surprise, surprise, is being embraced in the content development lifecycle. I have with me Nisha and Mayank, who are amazing experts on this topic, and will quickly introduce themselves. To open the event, one of the rituals we have here at Everest Group is just to ask where everyone's from and where are you joining from. We'd love to see the global diversity of the audience that we have here today. So I'll start first. My name is Nitish. I'm a partner with Everest Group. I lead our focus on interactive experience as well as sustainability, in addition to our work here in Europe. I'm joining personally from London, where it is unusually bright and sunny, something which we haven't had for most of April. So I'd love to know, where you're joining from. Please post it in the comments, and we'd love to see, what's the spread we have today. So Nisha, let me hand it over to you. Why don't you introduce yourself and also tell us where you're at today?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nitish. Hi, everyone. Good to be speaking to you all. I'm Nisha Krishan. I'm a practice director with Everest Group. And as part of my role, I lead our interactive experience team, where everything to do with the customer experience, both from a technology and services side, falls under. And I'm joining you all from Gurgaon, India. Looking forward to an amazing conversation today. Mayank, over to you.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Mayank. I'm a senior analyst, part of the interactive experience practice, and as a part of my role, I majorly look onto the MarTech side of things. So think of CDPs and DXPs, and also some of the new growth areas such as content supply chain and generative AI. I'm joining from Gurgaon and look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. That's great. And as comments start coming in terms of where people are from, we'll reference it, and can't wait to see the kind of audience we have here today. So we want to talk about content supply chain now. We also realize, as we were discussing this, Nisha, Mayank, and I, that this means often different things to different people. There's maybe sometimes not a consensus on the topic, unlike with people like us, who sometimes live and breathe these issues. So today we will talk about two or three things. One, we will talk about content supply chain. What does it mean? Why now? What's really happening in the space? Second, we'll talk about what are the typical pain points, challenges that CMOs as well as large brand leaders have when it comes to managing the life cycle of their content and assets in this digital first world. Then we'll talk about how AI is changing the way we do things, not just Gen AI, which has obviously been in the news for the last many months, but AI more broadly, and specifically where is Gen AI creating value. And then we'll talk about what does it mean in terms of where we go from here. What does it mean for doing this to create compelling experiences? What does it mean for providers, which is both service providers, consulting players, but also product and platform companies? And then what does it mean for people investing in this space? Where are the winners in content supply chain going to be? So we'll talk a lot about that, and let's see, the kind of conversation we have. But before we do, let's start with some of the basics. We don't want to make this a teaching lesson, but Nisha, can you talk a little bit about how we define content supply chain? What does this really mean? I know we have a big body of work on it, which I'm sure we'll share with our audience today, and some links as well. But what does it really mean? And the second, maybe related question is, what do you think is driving the need for something like content supply chain now?
Yeah, no, those are quite pertinent questions, Nitish, and thanks for raising them. But I think before I answer those questions, I want to, give a bit of a context in terms of where content supply chain fits in terms of the digital experience ecosystem. So we all know that one of the important topics in digital experience is personalization and customer engagement, and it is becoming increasingly important because brands are increasingly competing for attention. Customers have many, many options on their plate. But whenever marketeers talk about personalization, or whenever you hear, personalization in the industry, it's always viewed from the context of data, the data about the customers, activate first party data, data should not lie in silos, etc. But what is really missing in the conversation about personalization is content. Because it's one thing to understand your customers, but if you want to engage your customers, you should be able to create content that is compelling, that is high quality, that is generated very fast and that is available across a plethora of channels. And there are a number of predictions in the market. I mean, Mayank, Nitish, we keep talking about it, right? That the impact, that the demand for high impact personalized content is only going to multiply. There just aren't enough humans on the planet to meet the content demand, especially the content that is needed to drive personalization in the industry. And we're not even talking about the costs that are needed in order to create the kind of content that enterprises need. And that's where content supply chain comes into picture. And now let's understand what content supply chain really is. So content supply chain primarily consists of four stages, right? It consists of ideation. What kind of content do you want to create as an enterprise to engage your audience? Secondly, it consists of creation of content, and not just creation of any content that might resonate with your clients, but creation of content that is iterative, creation of content that follows very collaborative review cycles. And the third step is distribution and delivery of content. Today, a lot of enterprises are present across a number of channels. So it's not just about content for website or content for some other channel, but content that can seemingly be distributed across channels. And it doesn't end here, because it's not just about ideation, creation, and distribution, but you need to track the performance of your content, whether your customers are engaged, are they even looking at it? Is it eventually leading to sales or achieving the business goals that you want to be achieved through this particular content? And that's where tracking the performance becomes important. Now, a lot of you will realize that as I speak through this content life cycle, it is not something that is new. I mean, enterprises have continued to make a lot of investments when it comes to creation of content and distribution of content across channels. But what is really interesting as we speak about content today is the adoption of generative AI. Because traditional content supply chain processes, which all of us will agree to some extent are quite broken, but these processes can be made much more efficient and at the same time much more scalable with less number of partners and vendors that are needed in order to deliver it. So what content supply chain beautifully does for you with generative AI is that it brings the three T's within the organization together: your talent, which is needed in order to operationalize it, the tools which are needed to operationalize it, whether it is digital asset management, whether it is your CMS systems, whether it is the marketing workflows, and the third is the technique. So by bringing these three T's together, what content supply chain does is that it helps you create, deliver, manage slash optimize content across a number of online or offline channels that you might be present in. So that's in a nutshell what content supply chain is. Now, when generative AI enters into the picture or into this equation, what it beautifully does is that it helps marketeers with three fundamental things. A, it reduces the time that it takes to create content. And we all know that sometimes it takes days for people who are associated in the design and the creative industry in order to create a kind of content that might lead to brand differentiation and that might lead to personalization. But what GenAI beautifully does is that it reduces that time from days, in certain cases, weeks, to a few minutes in certain cases. But it's not just the generation of content where AI is playing a role. But the second thing that it does beautifully and powers the marketeers is that it helps them generate real-time insights on the content that is being created. So whether the content is working for the customers that you're trying to serve, whether it is helping you achieve the business goals, that's the second fundamental pillar. And the third fundamental pillar, which becomes really important, is that it's not just about creation or performance of the content, but it is also about scaling. You might be serving your customers in regions of Europe, you might be serving them in APAC, you might be serving them in Americas, and you need to localize the content for different regions. So it helps marketeers with not just generation or insights, but it helps a lot of marketeers with respect to scaling content and localizing it for almost all the audience that you continue to serve. So that's what the content supply chain means and what Gen AI is doing within this supply chain and empowering marketers in order to achieve the business goals. Now, as part of our day-to-day work, we keep talking to a lot of enterprises, especially the ones that have started to invest in this particular market. And Mayank, what will be interesting is I know that you have been participating in a lot of conversations with quite a few enterprises across different industries. So what do you think are some of the benefits that enterprises are looking forward to or are possibly already deriving when it comes to their investments in this space?
That's indeed an interesting question, Nisha. And before I answer on that, I would like to make a blanket statement, so to say, which is any enterprise moving forward who's serious about their content and campaign capabilities eventually does need to consider implementing a content supply chain. Now, with regards to the benefits, frankly, the biggest benefit that a content supply chain enables is the productivity gains. With regards to the shrinking of the campaign lifecycle timeline, we see around 30% gains being enabled over there on a 40-hour work week. And this is interesting, the entire creative process, the initial process of ideation, developing the content and getting it reviewed, there wasn't really any tool out there before generative AI came in which could automate or reduce the timelines over there. Now that this does exist, I think it's a game changers for marketers, and enterprises are benefiting the most in terms of productivity when they're implementing a content lifecycle. With regards to scalability, of course, there's a limit up to which a marketer can produce content on his own. So definitely, content supply chain is acting as a support system to speed up that delivery process of content as well. Localization, like you talked about, is another very pertinent example. These big enterprises which have marketing functions which need to cater to global audiences, it's much easier for them to work with something like a content supply chain, which can actually ensure that the assets are consistent with the global campaign that is being run. However, it is contextualized with regards to the local languages and the specificities which are required in a particular market. One of the biggest use cases I feel, though, is with regards to metrics. We keep hearing how marketers and CMOs are obsessed about OKRs. And mostly the metrics that they track are click through rates, something around the churn rate, the engagement of the campaign that they have. But with implementation of a content supply chain, you can actually track metrics in the ideation and content generation phases as well. The amount of time saved, the level of tweaking that Gen AI based content has required in order to take it to the final stages. A whole lot of new matrices have been enabled by the implementation of a content supply chain. And here's the interesting bit. It's not exactly plug and play. Marketers also need to undergo some process changes, so to say, in order to benefit the most from a content supply chain. So think about this, marketers are creative people. They are used to developing content in a certain way, and many times they're probably going to take up a pen and paper, sketch something out. Uh, when a content supply chain is enabled, it's more of a workflow. And in order to benefit the most, while the creative process goes on like before, you need to ensure that the data is being captured within the system so that everyone is aware of in which particular stage the content lifecycle is. And accordingly, all the various Gen AI related, review related processes which can speed up the timeline, those things are visible in the entire system. There's also a need for investment in content creation tools. Marketing organizations already have campaign analytics tools for sure, but there is a need in investing in tools which leverage Gen AI for content creation. To a large extent, we are already seeing marketers adopt this. In fact, some metrics show that more than 50% of marketers are already using Gen AI to create content, but that is slightly skewed more towards text, image somewhere being in the middle, and video is very nascent. And lastly, as I said, this metrics mentality, the tracking of click-through rates, churn rates, and essentially analytics related stuff around campaign, while that will still continue, marketers are also realizing that it's now possible to track metrics in the initial content ideation and generation stages as well.
So that's interesting, Mayank, that in your conversations you've come across quite a few benefits that marketers are either already realizing or they're looking forward to realize as they further go ahead and implement some of these solutions. You also mentioned Gen AI as you were talking about some of the advantages, and of course, I mentioned it as well as we were talking about what role Gen AI can play in the content supply chain lifecycle. Now, what is interesting for me to know, and I'd be very curious that in your conversations with enterprises, have you heard concerns with respect to not just operationalizing content supply chain end to end, but also, there are concerns around Gen AI, right? So if you implement Gen AI in content supply chain, there are definitely some of the concerns that you might have heard of. So curious to know what are some of those concerns that enterprises are talking about. And Mayank, the reason I ask this question to you because interestingly, as I was reading about this topic today, there was a very interesting thing that I read. People say that you have FOMO with respect to experimenting with Gen AI, the fear of missing out if you don't implement Gen AI. But the other point of view that I heard today is that people also have foggy, which means fear of getting in, because there are concerns related to generative AI. So, yeah, curious to know your take on what you are hearing from enterprises when it comes to challenges.
Oh, absolutely. And with anything as new, as nascent as Gen AI, as content supply chain, it is obvious that there will be certain challenges that organizations are going to face. I think one of the biggest things which will change is the entire marketing operating model will need to have a relook. Uh, the way marketing teams and the creative heads especially function is, even though they know the final target audience, even though they know the final campaign metrics and all those things, the path to that can sometimes be a little, let's just say, not process oriented or not workflow oriented, because creativity is a spontaneous action, so to say. I think we'll need a new marketing operating model which puts down the rules, puts down the guide rails that marketers need to follow. As to how it's going to look like, still early days. I think marketers as well as service providers will together sit down and see how the process is going to look like, how governance is going to look like, who has access to reviews, who has access to even use the tools to create content. There are a lot many things that marketing organizations, when they are implementing a content supply chain, they need to think about. Another interesting thing is that creativity has always been the domain of CMO, and that's frankly not going to change. But since now technology is playing such a big role, new market tools are going to be implemented into the landscape, it is essential to possibly get a buy-in of CIO and large organization CDOs as well. It is essential to have the main CXO stakeholders in the loop around the new systems that are going to be implemented, the new changes that are going to be enabled, as well as the new productivity gains and metrics that organization is going to realize. Lastly, I think with regards to consolidation of vendors, enterprises will also need to look into that. Content supply chain is not a single product platform, so to say. It's a collection of multiple tools and services all bundled together. So it makes sense to revisit the vendor landscape and try to rationalize it as much as feasible, because it will just make the lives of marketers easier with regards to OKRs and ensuring that the service providers stick to the commitments that they're making. The last thing is Gen AI itself. It's new. It's really new. I think use cases around text and image have caught on well. Video is nascent, but the thing is, marketers and service providers will need to make some space in order to make rapid changes within the content supply chain, in order to ensure the new formats work, in order to ensure that some new regulations, be it for advertisement related, be it for Gen AI related, those are adhered to. Essentially, marketers just need to be prepared about the rapid changes that Gen AI is undergoing through. In fact, while we are on the topic of Gen AI, Nitish, I know you recently participated in the Adobe Summit. I'm sure you talked to Adobe folks as well as various service providers. So I'm curious to learn what you're hearing on that front.
Yep, I think Mike, that's a fair point. And before I do that, I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions through the LinkedIn Live platform. So please feel free to send your questions. As some of you have done. If you're more comfortable sending to us directly, please do that. We have received a bunch before today, which we will get to. So we want to spend some time answering your questions as well. So please, we look forward to them. So Mayank, you're right. I think Gen AI, while it's taking the industry by storm, content supply chain is not necessarily a very new concept. I think it's been known by different ways. I think reflecting on my time at Adobe Summit, but also their creative conference Max last week, I think there's a lot of focus around what does content supply chain look like in the era of Gen AI. And I think there are a few things that are emerging, right? So first, let's talk about where is um, content supply chain benefiting and the role of Gen AI, and where will this help revolutionize some stuff. So if you think about the broader work that we're doing on Gen AI and the early evidence that we're picking up 16 17 months in this journey, sales and marketing and specifically content supply chain is one of the top 3 use cases that enterprises are adopting using Gen AI, period, right? So there's a lot of focus on IT and IT ops, there's a lot of focus on contact center or CXM, and then there's a lot of focus on content supply chain within sales and marketing functions. So there's a widespread use of Gen AI already in various levels of maturity. Now, if you really think about where that's getting adopted, you see some metrics and stats and use cases on the screen. So if you look at the left side of the slide, there's a lot of implementation and content creation and ideation, which you can see. Creation obviously becomes easy because you can personalize content, you can create rapidly, and it's going beyond text to images, sounds. Obviously, there's a deep fake element to this, but also now things like video, right? If you look at the latest OpenAI Sora model and everything you can do with text to video, there's a lot more. Having said that, I think there are still some guardrails around safety that people are trying to figure out. I think where content supply chain is a little bit more nascent is maybe on market data analysis, which is my content working? How do I activate it? How do I reverse feedback or provide a reverse feedback loop into the process? So if you really think about the broad ways in which content supply chain is changing because of Gen AI, is maybe 3 or 4-fold. One is increased productivity and speed. So I can generate content faster, personalize it at scale, do 24/7 content production in some ways. The second big vector is improved efficiency and cost saving. So doing less manual work, streamlined workflows, content localization and translation. And the third big element is enhanced quality and engagement, right? So this holy grail of data-driven insights, content experimentation, as well as personalizing content experiences. I think the third one, enhancing quality, is where people are still figuring things out. One of the questions CMOs are asking us is, what does this mean in terms of their talent? I think that's a big what if scenario for the industry, which people have not figured out. We've seen clients who have now chosen not to increase their creative teams at the same levels they would pre-Gen AI. To me, this is the age-old question of what does AI do to jobs and talent generally. I feel there's going to be a lot of mediocre content because of Gen AI, which floods the market. But the high-quality content and the curated content is where clients are going to focus on. So in some ways, if you think about it, Gen AI, I think somebody said this nicely, Gen AI or AI lowers the barriers to entry to create content, but it raises the bar, which means it's easier to create content. So a lot of content floods in, but to stand out, you still need a human in the loop and create distinctive content-led experiences. So those are the things we are seeing. Now, the second thing very quickly that we're seeing because of Gen AI and what it does to content supply chain is maybe how does it change and how does it influence the campaign development lifecycle? Again, if you look at how this will be used to develop marketing campaigns, will it be used to drive personalization at scale? How will it be used perhaps to automate manual tasks? I think is a big thing. Now, if I think about not just Gen AI, one of the main themes that we've also been fielding from clients, whether it's buyers or providers in the last few months, is around what is the architecture on which content supply chain sits? What are the platforms? What's the tooling? Mayank, you refer to the fact that there is so much tooling that people have already. So what does this based on? So, Nisha, let me open it up to you just on that topic. One of the controversies and one of the questions that came in before the event today is content supply chain just based on previously DAMs, digital asset management platforms, and it's just a fancy way of looking at it? or is this fundamentally different? So what do you think about the product and the platforms on which content supply chain is based, and how that links to investments in DAM and other things, maybe like CMS?
Thanks for raising that, Nitish. And I think that's an important question because I think one of the things that marketers struggle with is that, okay, this content supply chain, new word is floating in the industry. Does that mean I add more MarTech tools to an increasingly complicated MarTech architecture and keep worrying about the ROI that I'm deriving from it? So I think with that broader context, if you understand the tooling that is associated when it comes to operationalizing content supply chain, it is not fundamentally different from what enterprises have traditionally invested in when it comes to prior content supply chain life cycles. So most of the enterprises have invested in digital asset management because that's where you manage all the assets you create. That's where branding guidelines are. That's where all the assets that you need within an organization flow into different channels that you are trying to engage your customers with. So from a tooling perspective, DAM becomes important. The other thing that becomes important is a CMS system because that helps you not just manage content but push content across the different channels that you're present in. Both DAM, both CMS, the organizations have continued to and traditionally invest in. The other tooling that is required are a plethora of tools that might exist for content creation and review systems. Now, while enterprises have traditionally invested in it from a tooling perspective, what becomes important for the CMOs of today is to adopt tools which are Gen AI based for content creation in order to leverage all the productivity advantages that Mayank, Nitish, and I have been talking about throughout the session. So while content creation tools exist, but today there are a plethora of tools that marketers need to take advantage of, which are Gen AI based, which, as I said previously, reduce the effort that is required for content creation from days, weeks to possibly a few minutes or a few hours. So that becomes important. The other newer thing that has come into picture, in my opinion, are the review systems. Now, I'm not saying that traditionally marketers have not invested in tech/tools which review with content with respect to branding guidelines, etc. But today, as we talk about content supply chain, we're talking about Gen AI generated content, right? So there needs to be systems, processes, people, tech in place in order to review the content, whether it is following your branding guidelines, whether there are any ethical issues or inaccuracies with respect to the content that is being generated by a plethora of tools that you might have within the organization. So we spoke about DAM, we spoke about CMS, we spoke about content creation tools and review systems as well. The other thing that's also interesting, and I think some of the enterprises are seeing huge benefits from, are the systems that define marketing workflows and collaboration across different teams. Because, see, it's one thing to have different tech and martech tools, but if you are not able to integrate all these tools with the people, so it's not just about taking tools to people, it is also about bringing people close to the tools, right? Where systems associated with definition of marketing workflows, systems associated with the promoting collaboration across different teams becomes important. I think that's a relatively newer area that marketers will increasingly need to think about. So yeah, I think those are some of the tools and technologies that become important.
Yep. No, it's a fair point and a fantastic answer. So Nisha is also thinking about another question that we received early on, which is, the techno, maybe it's going back to your 3T framing, right? I think we've spoken about technology, we've spoken about tooling, techniques, but if you think about what will it take for us to operationalize content supply chain at scale, with the promise of Gen AI, let's assume the promise of Gen AI fully plays out, and now we're able to orchestrate, content life cycles at a global level for different brands, for different experiences, while staying on brand with around branding guidelines and guardrails. What do you think are the critical determinants to be able to operationalize that, beyond what we've just discussed? Are there a few
Yeah.
specific determinants in your experience working with these large organizations?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I face pertaining to, when I speak to some of the enterprise clients who want to have conversations on content supply chain, want to have a vision of, having automated campaigning system, etc. is that stakeholders end up working in silos. Now content supply chain is not just an ambit of CMO or not just an ambit of CTO or CDO. So I think one of the fundamental things, Nitish, that is needed in order to operationalize content supply chain and make it real and derive the ROI benefits that I think Mayank was speaking about earlier is the stakeholder buy-in and the fact that it needs to be top down. It cannot be about some marketing function thinking about it and running it in silo. It will not give you the benefits that you think it might give. So stakeholder buy-in becomes important. And when I say stakeholder buy-in, bringing business units together. So what role will a CMO play? CMO will be the North Star for a CSE transformation. And what I mean by that, these are the people who would be expected to have a vision within the organization that this is what we want to invest in and these are the business outcomes we want to achieve. But that's not where it ends, right? The CTO or the CIO of an organization needs to come into picture because, as I said, while CMO might be the North Star, but CTO becomes the guiding light. CTO becomes the CSC architect. Nitish, you raised the question on what the tooling should look like, right? That CMO may not know about. They may know it at a higher level, but which tool is better suited for what? What tool do we already have within the enterprise? What kind of a composable MarTech system we possibly need to invest in? Those are some of the decisions that CTO will have to take. The other, I think, stakeholder that becomes very important is the CDO of the organization. Now, the reason I want to bring CDO into the picture is because there are quite a few organizations where the CDO roles exist and CMO role may not exist, may or may not exist. And the CDO becomes the custodian of everything to do with customer data or the data estate within the organization. CSC is not just about content. I started this conversation by talking to you about you need to measure the performance of the content where all the data and analytics comes into picture. So CDO buy-in is required. And last but not the least is the CFO buy-in. The economic situation, I mean the macroeconomic situation we find ourselves in. Enterprises are becoming more and more conscious of the ROI that they are deriving from all the investments that they are making. So the CFO wants to know it's not just another jazzy thing out there, but I am here to make the investment to get the right ROI. So I think from a stakeholder buy-in perspective, these four entities become really important. The second thing that becomes important in order to operationalize it, and I keep talking about it as I not just talk about CSC, but other aspects as well, that any tech you implement, it's one thing to implement technology in an enterprise, but it's another thing to train your people in a way that they continue to use it. So the change management aspect becomes very important. Content supply chain has aspects of people change management. It has aspects of process change management. And of course, it has aspects of tech change management. So if you are an IT service provider who has a client whom you're helping with operationalizing CSE, the conversation cannot start and end with MarTech. It has to include softer aspects of change management as well. The third point that becomes important is mitigating the risks associated with Gen AI. We keep talking about the fact, and Nitish was alluding to it earlier as well, that CSC is not new. How we do CSC is new. And how we do CSC, Gen AI kind of brings new colors and flavors to it, right? But there are risks associated with Gen AI. You need to have an AI compliance team within the organization. You need to tag the content that exists within your system, whether it is human generated content or whether it is AI generated content, because that does become important. You need to review the output. It cannot be as simple as, hey, I've automated this. This is the content. It directly goes into the channel without undergoing review output with respect to the branding guidelines, etc. So stakeholder buy-in, change management, mitigating the risks associated with Gen AI. And last but not the least, I alluded to it earlier when Nitish mentioned about the technology estate, is having a very efficient MarTech ecosystem. It is not about retiring your current technology solutions that you might have and embarking on something nice and fancy and jazzy. It is about what net new processes slash tools slash techniques you need to adopt in order to make this MarTech work for you. Are there composable solutions that you want to invest in? How do you make the best out of the CDPs that you might have invested in? So a very efficient MarTech ecosystem, thinking about the architecture, etc., also becomes important if you have to make this, a ground reality for you.
Yep,
Yeah.
I think those are all very, very valid points. And people might be wondering that we showed some slides today. Maybe how can I get access to our research and maybe more? So what you will quickly see is a link to download a complimentary abstract of a groundbreaking report that we published end of last year, which is around the state of the market for content supply chain. This is something we've seen a lot of interest in, and also stay tuned to our updates. We are very bullish on this topic. You will see a lot of research advice from us through the year, and you will see how we plan to expand our coverage of content supply chain, and this is something we will keep on top of. So you'll quickly see a link pop in. You can register your interest and you'll get a complimentary abstract of this to download around content supply chain. So I was also reflecting on one more question, and Mayank, let me bring you in at the stage. One of the other questions people were thinking about is, based on this early evidence of Gen AI and the early impact, I think we also have to contextualize it with the fact that this is still early on. There's a lot of stuff that
Mm.
we've seen which works, but there's a lot of stuff to be determined in terms of how this scales. But how do you see this industry growing, or this function growing as a result of Gen AI, but not just because of Gen AI, but accelerated by it? So what do you think are the other things we should think about as over the next 12, 18, 24 months as we get to the home stretch of this session?
Oh, I think it's still nascent. There exists some solutions out there by product vendors which are competent, but the biggest thing that I'm looking forward is how service providers enter and change this game. There are a lot many service providers out there who have a ton of experience implementing the Martech products, which together stitch and create content supply chain. Many have experience in managing marketing operations as well. So, how they amalgamate the two in order to bring in their own flavor into the space is, I think, one of the biggest things that I'm looking forward to. Along with that, I think the big change which will come is when video content generation picks up steam. We are already quite familiar with regards to content generation via text. Many organizations have already deployed chatbots with regards to it. The large marketing teams, they are utilizing Gen AI to create image-based content and then refine the same before publishing it to the wider world. But video is new. It's intensive, and by that logic, the efficiency gains that it will enable is also possibly the biggest. So that is another area down 12 months down the road, which I'm really excited to look forward.
Absolutely. I think that's a fair point. And I think in some ways governing this and operationalizing this, the role of services is going to be important, right? Because it is about scaling this, not just about the tech. And how do you then still have quality controls and a human in the loop to manage how this is being done and disseminated? So I think those are very valid points. One of the last questions we want to take up today, and Nisha, let me bring you in on this one, is, does the need for content supply chain and what you might do with content supply chain, rather, does that change by industry? Are we seeing some industry archetypes or industry flavors to this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting question, Nitish. And I think it also comes from a place where when we talk about content, we tend to think of content only from the perspective of personalization and customer experience. And when we think about that, the first industry that comes into play is, the retail and the CPG industry, and to some extent BFSI. So there might be a tendency among a number of people and service providers as well to think that content supply chain is only for companies which are advertising a lot, which are out there in terms of sharing a lot of content. But that is not true. In fact, Mayank, when I was speaking to you, we were discussing about a few conversations, right, that we have had with quite a few enterprises. And we have spoken to enterprises across the board, whether it is a retail company, whether it is a BFSI company, a tech company, or even healthcare for that matter. In fact, Pfizer is one of the classic examples, right? So Pfizer has actually been working on implementing it end to end. I think most of their solutions are based on the Adobe platform. And what they have done is that at Pfizer, if one of the new products is launched, and once it has received the regulatory approval, then they tend to enter that product into an automated cycle wherein the marketing assets are designed as part of that value chain. I'm sorry, not as part of value chain, but as part of that life cycle. And once these marketing assets are designed, then they're automatically routed for all kinds of regulatory reviews, whether it is a medical regulatory review, whether it is a legal review, etc. And once they are designed, once those medical, legal, and regulatory reviews are done, then they are uploaded on the DAM system. And once they are on the DAM system, then brochures for doctors, emails for patients can be triggered through that. The same content can be made available through a lot of through a couple of B2B or B2C websites that they have. So I think my point of view on this industry is that while certain industry may invest in this more than the others, but don't ignore a particular sector just because intuitively it does not make sense that this sector might invest in customer experience. Every organization is a custodian of content. Every organization is in the business of serving their clients. And hence it becomes important for you to actively talk about or to actively think about having a very robust content supply chain in place.
Absolutely. I think that's a fair point. And I think that industry example brings this to life. And I think each industry or organization will have, use cases in content supply chain, which are maybe specific to their industry. I can completely imagine in life sciences, the way you develop content for different stakeholders like HCPs or healthcare practitioners or physicians is going to be very different to patients. It's going to be very different to regulators. Similarly, if you think of your own employees, where you're seeing a lot of content supply chain happen as well, right? I think one of the users I'm seeing for content supply chain tends to be the CHRO, where a lot of employee communications now, from signage and lifts in offices to how employee comms are rolled out is happening through these tools. So I think the possibilities are immense, but understanding what's specific to your industry or stakeholder and what's going to be a largely horizontal use case, I think is important. I think we're coming to an end. So I'd like to close out with the fun thing we typically do at some of these LinkedIn lives, which is, put both of you on the spot and, ask you for one recommendation, and don't go more than one line around what do you think will happen in this industry if you were to speak 1 year from now. Imagine we're speaking on the 30th of April 2025. What is one thing that you think would have played out in this market then? So Mayank, let me start with you.
Oh, a one-liner. Well, many more productivity gains.
That's fair. Nisha, can you top that?
Yeah, first of all, Nitish, thank you that you mentioned that one liner. I so love the sound of my voice. I would have, gone ahead and given a paragraph to you. But if it were to be a one liner, I think still early days, but a lot of investments that still need to be made with respect to orchestrating the ecosystem around it.
Perfect. And if I was to put myself on the spot, I'd say I think it's going to be about evolution, not a revolution. So I'm personally excited about what we've seen. I think how we now mature this is, I think, the big question. So I'm sure we'll come back at some point to share our opinions on this, and you can also get access to our research. Again, shameless plug for the link that you'll see in the chat where you can access this report, but also stay tuned to more such events and our research on content supply chain. So I'd like to thank our audience for both, participating online today and also the questions that we received before the LinkedIn Live. I know we couldn't get through everything. We didn't have enough time, and we try to make these conversations more informal and more punchy. So I'm sure we'll be back for a more detailed chat on this. But in the meanwhile, you can subscribe to our research. You can, reach out to any of us or our teams, and we'll try and get in touch. Perfect. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time today. And Nisha and Mayank, thanks for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.